If you're new in town or just new to this whole podcast thing, you're tuning in to Law by Night, the podcast that discusses all things vampiric with no fear of breaching the masquerade. In this special episode, we shall review The Black Hand playing the Sabbat, a homebrew for Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition. I shall present my thoughts and opinions on its presentation and mechanics to help you better decide whether this is the homebrew for you. In the previous episode of the podcast, we looked at the V5 Sabbat book, and for anyone who hasn't listened to my review yet, I will give you a short summary of my thoughts that doesn't spoil too much of its content. I hate it. I hate what it did, I hate what it missed, and I hate where the future of V5 is probably headed. I know many share my sentiment, and a lot of people are not happy with the handling of the Sabbat in that book, resulting in not one, but 3 different homebrew supplements, one of which being the focus of this additional episode, my free review copy of The Black Hand playing the Sabbat, provided by one of its authors, Kaldon Khalil, whose name you probably recognise from the Sabbat book for V5, amongst other things of course. But Law, if you don't like the V5 Sabbat book, why are you reading this? Because, dear listener, I had some hope that maybe this would make the Sabbat more tolerable, that perhaps I could try introducing this version of the Sabbat in mine and other people's V5 games, even if it meant trying to convince folks to spend an additional $24 to do so, which already feels a little dirty in of itself, given how expensive the V5 Sabbat book is. But with those questions in mind, one should really get started on the first homebrew review on the Law by Night podcast. But before I do that, here are the rules for the Law by Night book reviews. I will explore snippets of the lore, mechanics and rules found within the tome. I will look as to how they are presented and easily they are conveyed to new and old players alike. As this is a review written and presented by me, all thoughts and opinions are my own, so if you disagree with something I have said, that is totally fine. It does not mean that you are right and I am wrong and vice versa. And if I wasn't clear enough by now, I am strongly going to advise you to listen to my review of the Sabbat book for V5, as I'll be referring to things in that book and comments I made there. As of the recording of this episode, The Black Hand, playing the Sabbat, is only available as a 135-page PDF via the Storyteller's Vault and DriveThruRPG that serves as a player's guide to the V5 Sabbat book, be it in an unofficial homebrewed sense. As such, I cannot make the usual comments on what the book feels and looks like. That said, my phone, which is where I stored the PDF, is currently a headrest for my Cavapoo Emma, so that is now forfeit, I suppose. As for the book itself, it very comfortably fits into the V5 style, an intense amount of clear white with various photos scattered throughout the book, most of which exist in the V5 core book, the Cameron and Anarch books, which are either unique to those books, or stock photos that can be found with a simple Google search, judging by the huge list of interior artists credited. None of the photos particularly move me here, but some of them do confuse me. For example, a whole page is dedicated to a slightly unravelled tape cassette and an iron ball in full daylight. These are 2 separate photos. There is actually a strange amount of daylight photos for a book about monstrous vampires. Some of the photo choices do not gel well with the text on the page, making it difficult to read, particularly pages 20 and 108, both present the start of a new topic and a chapter in a weird place. It is a very amateur error, one that could easily be avoided if function prioritised over aesthetic and more care was put into the formatting, where one person had the sole job of making the book look nice, one that was devoid of any writing. Some photos have had the bisexual lighting treatment which, just like my review of the V5 Sabbat book, I am not terribly fond of here. Well, what are the Sabbat in the eyes of the Cameron and Anarchs, the vampires the most V5 players will be using in their games? Groups of untrustworthy vampires that described on more than one occasion as sexual predators that everyone fears and hates for trying to pervert the status quo and infect them with their malicious taint. Where I would usually applaud the use of bylighting, this artistic direction here strikes a little too close to home, and I am disappointed this narrative is the one being pushed. Again. The front cover, however, I believe is a Mark Kelly piece, a unique painting/portrait commissioned for the homebrew. It's not my favourite piece he has done, admittedly, but I will admit that it's aesthetically pleasing and fits the current inception of the Sabbat. Moving swiftly onwards to the introduction of the book, we are presented with the themes and goals of the book that presents and reinforce the pack types which I spoke about in my V5 Sabbat book review. These sections start, however, with some massive contradictions. The Sabbat, according to V5, has been an integral part of the core gameplay, which is strictly not true. Yes, there are ties between the Sabbat, Gehenna and the Beckoning in V5, but such conflicts have not really been touched upon in any book, and it has only taken the writer some 3 years to properly acknowledge the existence and activities of the Sabbat, other than they are fighting against the antediluvians somewhere somehow. We are also introduced to a handful of new words that are found in a handy little lexicon for those new to the V5 Sabbat world, most of which are massively different to their previous incarnations in older editions, most particularly the Seraphim, which had no mentioning in the V5 Sabbat book proper. Previously, Seraphims, or Seraph for short, decide assassinations to be carried out. They pass judgments onto Black Hand members accused of any disloyalty, disobedience to their superiors, or any offence against the Sabbat's Code of Milan, and this is Black Hand as in the secretive military sect rather than V5's adaptation of the Black Hand, which is another name for the Sabbat. They also judge their own members on accusations of infernalism, refusing to surrender them to the authority of the Sabbat Inquisition. In this homebrew, they are now warlords that have founded a cult of personality who follow their teachings or example, which I think is such a weird bastardization of the role, one that leans into biblical seraphims a tad too much. Chapter 1 begins with a strange excerpt from an Oscar Abadia, a Sabbat Seraphim preaching the word of Cain, the Dark Father. Each chapter follows a similar sort of verbiage in a different character voice, but I'm highlighting this one exclusively because they are the host of an Our Blood podcast. Whilst I'm pretending this is a little nod to yours truly, Vampiric Nerdle with a podcast, but why the fuck is someone in such a high rank breaching the Masquerade in such a fashion? In fact, why is the Sabbat even bothering at all with such trivial tech? It seems somewhat out of place. I never imagined cults reaching out to the masses with modern trends. Then again, it would certainly explain Joe Rogan's influence. But I digress. The first chapter of the book is where most of the crunch happens outside the third chapter. Chronicle tenets, predator types, advantages, and the adaptations of the Path of Enlightenment are all documented in this chapter for players to use when creating their Sabbat character. The chapter probably starts with the process of turning over to a Path of Enlightenment, mainly from the perspective of the freshly embraced Shovelhead, making highly insensitive mental health descriptors to define the trauma of the Shovelhead. Triggered is also inappropriately used when referring to compulsions of a pack later in the chapter, which is just gross. It's something you can't help, but not trauma-related, and I'm seriously concerned that these things are included, but I will get onto that later in this review. This first section of the chapter makes it quite clear that the Sabbat has to beat down your humanity fast, force you into this warlike mentality, and believe in one of these Path of Enlightenments, giving the impression that their humanity would be really fucking low, no higher than 3, as the vampire is already a fucked up piece of work. Not in this homebrew, as a vampire starting on humanity 6, yes, 6, can start following a Path of Enlightenment, which I find totally bizarre and against everything that the Sabbat would stand for. I would admit that many younger neonates are forced into Path of Enlightenments far too soon, but not humanity 6. That's just silly. Humanity is still used as a thing for players to have to track, rather than adopting a unique character sheet found in other homebrews and older editions of Vampire the Masquerade. Next, we are presented the Sabbat tenets for players to use in place of Chronicle tenets, and, like the previous sections of the homebrew and the book it is supporting, has major contradictions. The paths force the vampire to pay no regard to their former mortal life and humanity and the constraints said mortals bring, yet the third example is, never kill civilians. No, not all Paths of Enlightenment encourage senseless violence, at least not in older editions anyway, but how can one live by that creed and never deny your beliefs, the guilty must be punished, or freedom requires sacrifice? The Sabbat are fighting a war and do not really take prisoners other than to fuck with the enemy as part of psychological warfare. For a cult sect focused on liberating their kind from the wrath of blood-sucking demigods, there are a lot of nevers to be found in the Sabbat, aren't there? Some of the example tenets are also weirdly childish. The tenet of never snitch feels like it was written by someone's child, and the tenets of always wear black and death is fleeting just made me cackle as how they would appeal to a certain audience with annoying levels of late 80s angst, and I don't mean that as a pleasant nostalgic trip for older fans. Following this are the four main paths of the Sabbat practice in V5, which are the Path of Cain, Path of Kafari, Path of Death into the Soul, and Path of Power into the Inner Voice, that each has its own convictions and advantages. If you read the V5 Sabbat book, you will know that I have omitted one main path, the Path of the Sun, which is not present in this homebrew, as it is not a complete path and is only available for thin bloods, which heavily undermines its alleged importance in the V5 Sabbat book and discourages players to try Duskborn Sabbat characters, even though the thin-blooded have always been destroyed for being walking bringers of the end times. To replace it is the Path of Lilith, which is just as bizarre for the opposite level of importance. It has always been a heretic path, or forsaken path as it's referred here into the V5 Sabbat book, as to revere Lilith is to mock Cain, but there seems to be a stronger allegiance going on here for reasons? Weirder still, those that follow the Path of Cain don't seem to mind these Bahari now, which doesn't make much sense to me, for the lore reason of the two don't really see eye to eye. Sure, you would have some Nodistans Bahari trying to study the other, but only to further their understanding in Cain and Lilith respectively. Ultimately, I feel this was done to include the already vast amount of Bahari V5 content officially out there, which only makes the negligence of the main V5 Sabbat book all the more confusing. Whilst I'm rambling about the Path of Cain, the conviction examples here are okay. The Path of Kafari follows much of the same confused and murder hobo vibes as they do in the V5 Sabbat book, with none of the sinful nuance found before, only with the convictions contradicting each other. One must break the rules and indulge every temptation, but not harm the spiritually pure and innocent, but find those worthy to be tested on. Altogether, none of those make any sense. Similarly, the Path of Death into the Soul doesn't quite seem to get the point of it either, although it is slightly better than the V5 Sabbat book's description. The convictions here are just a lot of nevers, which is just a little odd to see. Path of the Power and the Inner Voice bewildered me also, simply because of their display of power involves wearing tiaras as part of their fashion sense. Viewing themselves as street kings and queens is fucking laughable. Might have worked in 13th century medieval Europe or a little girl's birthday party, but not in the 21st century. I also find it hard to believe that the Path of Power and the Inner Voice, a path of enlightenment that demands the individual to be in control all the time, would want to frenzy when the beast takes control? Finally, there is the Path of Lilith, which I have talked about already. What I will add here that I didn't mention before is how odd the compulsion is, which reminds me of the old Ravnos weakness. They have a different symbol here too, which I feel was a little unnecessary, as not only do the Bahari have a range of their own symbols to pick from, the one presented here is significantly worse. You may have noticed that I have missed out the advantages part of this section, and that is simply because I hate all of them and how gamey they feel. They gear specifically to the power gamers amongst us, and I hate how un-Vampire the Masquerade it feels, especially as each one offers the entire pack of discipline, the overly powered ones. There are two exceptions to this. The first are the advantages to the Path of Power and the Inner Voice, which feel oddly on par with the path itself and the Sabbat, given how much of a joke they are to read here. The second exception is the Path of Death and the Soul advantage, deeply haunted, because of how fucking stupid it is. It attracts spectres that view the pack as allies, just vibing in a haunted domain. This wound me up so much that my initial notes for this when I was reading this section of the book went, "Spectres? Fuck off!" There are many lore reasons as to why this wouldn't work as simply as the advantage implies, but at least there is an awareness in this advantage to state they could be tricked or compelled into doing other tasks. Personally, I believe they should be dominated into near submission, given the twisted nature of the Sabbat and the desire of the Spectres to fuck with everything in the Skinlands, given the last time they were able to access as easily as this, they caused the Great Depression. The penultimate part of what probably feels like a very long chapter to you listeners are the plentiful prototypes that I didn't mind too much. They made sense of the Sabbat ethos in my mind and weren't terribly offensive. That said, the executioner prototype is really odd as it actively encourages the Sabbat to protect the mortals, the children of Seth. Got weirdly inappropriate Batman vibes from this. I am Night. I am Vengeance. I'm Batman the Sabbat. Having spent most of the chapter and most of the V5 Sabbat book emphasizing the fact that all anti-tribute are now clanless, we are presented with the clans of the Sabbat having okay write-ups. Well, all except one clan, and you can probably guess which clan that is. Of course it is fucking Clan Malkavian. It is very cringy fishmilk, reminding me of the worrying few in the community who self-identify as Malkavians because they think mental illnesses are cute, despite never actually getting any proper diagnosis or struggled with it, knowing how it affects their daily life. Certainly has never been mocked for it either or lived through the trauma that can all do, but I am honestly not surprised this is the direction the authors took with the Malkavians, given how low regard mental health has been treated in this book so far, and Malkavians can only be damaged good despite the books and the community's attempt to push away from that narrative. What I wasn't expecting is the handling of Goretrix, the OG Tremere anti-tribute. For some reason, the authors decided to alter Goretrix's gender, insisting it has always been ambiguous, deciding on the she-they pronouns, as opposed to the he-him ones I believed they were, making Goretrix trans. I doubted myself for a few seconds, feeling I misremembered the whole growing his penis back theme when Sirius was created. I didn't. I read the Twitter and Discord thread that explained this change in narrative, a choice that probably made the authors feel very proud of themselves for being super inclusive, and I'm deeply concerned. Someone amongst the three decided that he lobbed his own dick off, so now Goretrix is a woman, and the other two just nodded and went along with it. First of all, making a toxic gay/bi man as a toxic woman doesn't make them any better because they still are toxic. Second, and most fucking offensive of all, it is incredibly transphobic, and that is just not me, a cis white male saying that, but 3 trans friends of mine. This, 100%, was based around the false idea that Goretrix has no penis and therefore must be a woman, which is simply not the case at all. And I'm not even going to attempt to waffle about the blatant bi-erasure because A, I don't think that would have even occurred to any of them, unfortunately, and B, I really do not think we need another Sasha Vikos in VTM. Do you? This sort of attitude is something of a problem in the LGBTQ+ community that only benefits cisgendered gay men. We can't have him be a bad representation for white cisgendered homosexual males, we'll make him a trans woman instead. This may not have been the intention, but the result is that you've offended the rest of the group instead. At last, we're at Chapter 2. To start things off, we are presented with a variety of Sabbat packs which mechanically serve almost identically to coterie merits in the V5 core book. They are engaging enough for me to attempt to potentially adapt to other games, but like the following unique communal havens, contradicts the idea of Sabbat staying in a city for a long period of time, as well as the never-ending question of does the Sabbat conquer domains or do they just trash everything and then leave? The names of these packs are very MMO sounding, which doesn't sit well with a more serious and grounded Sabbat, in my opinion. Following this, there is the mentioning of their lore sheets before moving on to the retays such as the Voldery, Fire Dance, Creation Rites, and other fan favourites, all bastardised and condensed into the simplest possible way to understand without becoming too patronising. Monomancy is featured here, which has a better description of what it is, one that is closer to the ye old meaning of the retay but conflicts of how it is applied in the V5 Sabbat book. Ignobilus retay does not really get much coverage here, but the numerous retay seem to go on forever. Now, I have never heard of this type of retay before, so I am assuming these are brand new to this homebrew, which doesn't surprise me, given how I hate every single one of them for how video gamey they are, especially the Enochian Spear and the Saturnine Sign. It does feel that 2 different people wrote the 2 main retays in this chapter, and that's by no means a compliment. This uncomfortably leads me onto the 3rd chapter, which is the Goodies and Toys chapter, starting with the disciplines, many of which have weirdly 80 sounding nicknames. An exception to this was the Blood Sorcery discipline, where one of these nicknames is Coldonic Sorcery, and I am not even going to begin to explain how that is simultaneously correct and wrong. I often don't pay much attention to new disciplines in source books because that is not the point of vampires and the world of darkness to me, even with the Sabbat, but this book is littered with new powers for each discipline, all weird and violent. That said, I am not a fan of any of them for this reason and how they cater more for murder hobos. That, and some of these powers already exist, such as Bring It On, which is just orb but with more edge. Blind Sight is another one, duplicating the needs of Eyes of the Beast but with childish gimmicks like eye stalks or feelers. There are also some rituals too, which don't do much for me either. Veil of Life is worth mentioning though, as that is practically the same as Blush of Life, just with a couple of minor differences. Following this are reiterations of the advantages section found in the main core book and how the Sabbat would use them, which I thought was one of the more genuinely helpful sections of the book, reminding the new players that the Sabbat are monsters with little need for petty mortal possessions. Weapons? Fuck yeah, those are staples of violent murder hobos, for which there are plenty to be had here, each with their own mechanics and suggestions for the storyteller to implement. Some are mundane, such as the nail bat and chainsaw. Some a little more exotic, like the nail gun and the somewhat insensitive explosive vest, whilst others take the form of relics, which makes the section feel gamier yet again. Oh, and Augustus Giovanni is dead in this apparently, as you can wield his tongue to deter lies. In Cult of the Blood Gods, no one really knows whether he was dead or not, but apparently those rascal Sabbat Hakata run away with his livery tongue for fucking weird ass reasons. There are also some stats for NPCs that could be used as enemies, allies or mentors, like revenants and the advisor concept. One NPC idea I will highlight are the Blood Brothers, which has had a slight retcon in creation and function which I'm honestly not too bothered about. This is partly because the Blood Brothers have never been terribly important to me, but their creation is far less abhorrent and morally acceptable at the table than what it is canonically. That said, they might seem out of character for the Sabbat. The final chapter is a whole mishmash of things, starting with a nonsensical character creation portion that should have gone with the Path of Enlightenment stuff at the beginning, as I would be hard pressed to find anyone playing V5 with just this homebrew. Just before that is the mentioning of the Ashira, who have been discussed a few times in this homebrew, which I find somewhat interesting. Some idea regarding them knowing about the beckoning and allegedly being able to manipulate it was a bit dumb, but it did spark a little inspiration to me in how that could be weaved into something more official, but not much, as the whole concept of the beckoning is pretty non-existent to the grander canon now anyway, just ignored like the rest of the V5 narrative. The rest of the chapter is divided into ST and player etiquette in the form of a safe play, which I really appreciate, particularly the problem players and ST section. The safe play section is accompanied by a worksheet found at the back of the book, which is not fillable, which is a shame. Given how most of the community are playing via Discord or Skype because of the current COVID pandemic, it might have been beneficial to provide a fillable version of the sheet as a separate PDF alongside the book. The other half of the chapter is a lot of lore sheets. By a lot, I mean 18, which I am not going to go through in detail for you. I will mention once again that the information presented on Gortrix contradicts his current V5 lore and every entry of him prior to that. I have to say that the existence of this homebrew is a very interesting one. A large Twitter thread by one of the authors saying how the Sabbat has finally been done right, a direction they have aimed for years, as part of a fairly controversial sourcebook, only to work and create homebrew of their own, barely 3 months after the release of said sourcebook, that really undercuts that book by saying you can play the Sabbat in V5. I have always believed the Sabbat an excellent vehicle for exploring the degrading humanities of vampire, as I ranted with my review of the V5 Sabbat book, which went live a few days ago as of this recording. Many folks, both player and writer, just simply lack the nuance to properly achieve it. Now, there is nothing wrong with this. The Sabbat are supposed to be alien monsters from the outsider's perspective, and we, the mortals, and the Camarilla and Anarchs are seen as slaves and cattle from the eyes of the Sabbat, and it is their mission in Unlife to free and destroy the interlopers. One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, as they say. Obviously, implementing such a mindset requires an extensive amount of work to conceptualize and implement, especially with a system like V5, which is very much rooted in its humanity-only approach. Whereas my idea to make the Sabbat playable in V5 involves a total rework of the character creation process that would accommodate their own altered systems, the Black Hand playing the Sabbat attempts to make the Sabbat playable in V5 by shoehorning what feels like a load of rejected ideas that didn't make the cut for the V5 Sabbat book proper, clearly feeling like 3 people worked on this book rather than one unified voice. The Black Hand playing the Sabbat is a homebrew that fills me with intense levels of dread, not because the book's material made me fear the Sabbat, but because it confirmed a lot of my worries regarding the future of Vampire the Masquerade 5th Edition, a push for a more trivialized and gamey world of darkness, trying to emulate the successes of Dungeons & Dragons, neglecting what made the world of darkness dark, not excessive blood-based powers, an army of war ghouls or sheer brutality, but the helplessness of being a small fish in a pool of great white sharks. Your powers are only meant to get you so far. You have to be on your feet and chat out your arse the whole time to survive one more night in a world pushed forward by engaging lore and narrative. Only that is apparently not what fans want, judging by the glowing reviews on the Storyteller's Vault. Then again, this is a fan base that thrives on toxic positivity, where there is a loud voice screaming how this is a flawless, perfect edition that is just happy with anything new. No lore, no culture, no problems, just vampires being queer cute Ooh, people! Now, I would mention that this total whitewash approach to world building is just as problematic on the other end of the scale, but I feel it would fall on deaf ears. If you are that breed of player that enjoys having a ton of wacky disciplines at your disposal, or genuinely loved how the Sabbat were presented in the V5 Sabbat book, and you really want that player's guide add-on, this is probably the book for you. Whilst I am not a fan of this book, or the material it builds off of, I will not and cannot recommend this book in good faith. It is filled with constant transphobic slander, insensitive disregard to mental health, and lack of understanding of trauma, which shows with the absence of sensitivity readers and editors outside the team, which, in my opinion, doesn't count. I am also alarmed that the test players are not named and didn't notice these glaring issues either. That said, I doubt the test players for the supplement were the sort of people that such glaring issues would affect anyway. And for those of you who are new to the Law by Night brand and the reviews I occasionally do, I do not do out of 10 scores because they are subjectively pointless. One person's 10 out of 10 is another's 3 out of 5 stars, which is another's minus 42 out of 100, so I shall rate this book Golf Club out of 10, as that is just as helpful as a proper out of 10 score. To be kept updated, follow the Law by Night VTM Twitter and Instagram pages to find out when we upload each episode. You can also find out by subscribing to the YouTube channel and clicking on the little bell, as you'll be immediately notified when the latest episode is live. Until next time, farewell.